Morticians of Reddit, what is the most bizarre, uncomfortable, creepy etc. case or situation you've had to deal with? Not a mortician, this comes from my mother back when she was a teenager. Guy she knows takes a job with the local funeral home. He works the graveyard shift. All was well for the first few months. Dude is often weirded out at work, claims that the building is haunted. Earlier in the evening, they get a call from the hospital saying that they have a lady there ready for pickup. They pick her up. Guy is freaking out, says he has a bad feeling. Later in the evening, Mortician has to step out for a bit, leaving Guy there alone with a dead lady. He goes about his work, still a little freaked out. Suddenly he hears this low, soft moan. He swears it is just his mind playing tricks on him, goes about his business. He hears it again, little louder than last time. It is late. He is alone, he is just hearing things, probably just the pipes settling. The plumbing is old after all. Short time passes and it is louder. At this point he is sure he isn't just imaging things. He knows he heard the dead lady moan. His first thought was the mortician was fricking with him. He has been shaken all evening and this shoal is pranking him. He marches over. Very funny you jerk. Yanks back the sheet covering the dead lady expecting to find the mortician somewhere around her. Dead lady grabs the guy's wrist, he lets out the scream and bolts for the door, forgets his car, runs all the way home. Turns out, old lady wasn't dead, hospital got it wrong. Hooray 1950s medicine. She had been in a coma or something and they had been sure she had passed on earlier that morning. She woke up at the funeral home and scared the ever-loving hell out of the assistant. He quit the next day, said he would never set foot there ever again. Lady I work with used to pick up the bodies for the coroner. One time they had to collect a woman that was laying in a very hot attic apartment for a couple months. All her liquids ran out onto the floor and dried, and when they tried to pick her up she started coming apart like an overly tender turkey. Her co-worker sent her to the van to get more bags, and when she got back he had finished bagging the lady. Classy. Changed how I think about turkey. One of my dad's good friends was the son of the local mortician, who later followed in his father's footsteps to run the business. In their 20s they lost one of their buddies. Pub was across the street from the funeral home. After a few drinks they decided to retrieve their buddy from the funeral home, propped him up on a bar stool and had one last drink with him. I always thought it a bizarre story but fully expected to see at least one other person post something similar. Kind of a Weekend at Bernie's but back in the 1950s. Mom was a mortician. Of the stories she's told me, creepiest would either be the guy that had his face eaten off by wild boars while hunting, guess he wasn't that good at it, or the guy that fell into a wood chipper. Funny, poor word choice. Thing was, I was at a breakfast a few days later where fellow high schoolers were trying to gross out the girls at the table, and when they pointed out that I wasn't really bothered by it, I kept chewing and said, yeah, my mom got that guy, said it was fricking gross. Everyone goes silent. I stopped chewing and looked up to everyone looking pale, shrugged, oh, yeah, all forgot she's a mortician didn't you, and kept eating. Uncomfortable for her was one that was also kind of sad. This woman was morbidly obese. Like, when they somehow all got her on the gurney at her home, when they were pushing it out, the wheels were pushing indentions down into the wood floors. Now this woman is what some bullies would call a whale. I wouldn't, but we all know shoals. Well, apparently this woman loved the crap out of some blue whales. Family kept going on and on about it. So the time comes for them to bring the clothes for her wake. They bring a big blue moo and a gaudy blue whale brooch. Then they hand her the CD to play. Usually it's church hymns or sad country songs etc. No one listens to it before, because why would you? So the service starts. Mom pops the CD in. Boop, goddamn blue whale calls fill the funeral home. My mom was very professional with her job, but every funeral director had to excuse themselves to compose themselves. Story from a friend of a friend. She The mortician met some guy at the bar. They hit it off and she gave him her number. Within a couple of days she finds out that the guy died in a car accident because his body ended up at her place of work. Before the funeral service she receives several calls from an unknown number, and whenever she picked up there was no response. Eventually, she got the eerie hunch that it may be him and proceeded to address him by name. Tells him to pass in peace and to stop calling. It worked. I'm an OBGYN, but when I was a med student I saw a weird case come into the ED. Woman in her late 60s, no known history on her. Found by a friend after a week of not picking up the phone, laying on the floor of her apartment naked. When she came in she was straight yellow, like street sign yellow on every inch of her body. I thought she had body paint on, but it must have been some catastrophic liver failure because she had crazy fluid retention in her abdomen as well. She was unresponsive, cardiac arrest. We started CPR, putting in a central line to her leg for fluid resuscitation, got an EKG hooked up but realized the EKG leads weren't sticking and that there was this red crap getting on our hands and scrubs with a funny smell. In addition to unseparate from the yellow skin, she was covered in ketchup, neck to shins. The EMTs had no idea how or why, and we never found out ourselves. Not a mortician, but my father is, and occasionally I hear some pretty FD up things. The worst one was about 10 or 15 years ago. Some good LA boy was backing his 18-wheeler up and getting ready to hook onto a trailer. Somehow in the process of trying to get locked in, the hydraulics failed and the trailer rolled back, crushing this guy to death. Upon arrival to pick up the body, my dad approaches the scene and there are a bunch of cops standing around, and he goes up to them and to get info on where the body was, and they all just kind of casually mumble and proceed to explain finally that there was a problem, that the majority of the body was able to be retrieved just fine, after they had the wrecker truck prop the trailer back up, but not the head, as it had gotten stuck on the front pin of the trailer and none of them knew how to get it off. My dad, having seen it all, stares all these guys down, goes up to the trailer and literally kicks the head off the end of this pin, and then scoops it up into his bag and heads for the car. As he passes by the cops he just mumbles barely enough for anyone to hear them. Scared. E-cats. I spent some time picking up bodies for the medical examiner. There are many stories, some of my own and some those who I worked with. One which is usually popular is that of a woman who died on her own in the reservation town. We arrived and the cop on the scene was quite disgusted with the place. He was looking forward to be deployed back to Afghanistan to get away from this town. The house when we arrived was an older house with several stories. The fence outside had been driven through by a car at some point. It was a night, of course. We entered the house and it was a complete mess. She was obviously a bit of a hoarder. I've seen much worse hoarders in this job, but she was on her way there. There was stuff piled everywhere. You couldn't tell what the floor was actually covered in because of all the garbage and paper and stuff ground into the floor. Probably hardwood underneath, as it felt so fairly solid, but tough to say for sure. The second floor was up a spiral staircase, and she was upstairs. Before we went up there the cop told us that the dogs had got her a little bit. We worked our way up the spiral staircase to the door that he had indicated she was behind. When we opened the door there was a body sitting in an office chair facing the door. However, it was a skull on top of a body. The dogs had eaten all of the skin off of her head. They also ate her breasts, and the implants from her breast were on the floor. She had several small dogs. They had started eating each other before her, so there was bones from at least one, probably two dogs scattered around. She had died and was not able to feed the dogs obviously, so they turned on each other and then her. The guy I was with started freaking out a little bit. It was a fairly disgusting sight, well beyond the average call that we went to. We were trying to figure out how to get her out of the chair. She was decomposed, of course. So she was covered in blisters that bodies get covered in as they decompose. We have to gather as much of the body as we can, so he grabbed her implants and what was left of her scalp with the hair attached off the floor. You don't want to pop those blisters if you can avoid it. They are very putrid when they leak out. In my partner's state of not knowing what the hell to do with her, He decided that the easiest way to get her out of the chair was to kick the chair out from under her. So he did. She came crashing to the floor and the blisters burst. It was now a horrible mess of oozing pus. We had our portable stretcher, as obviously we aren't going to bring the one with wheels up the spiral staircase. We don't generally bring that up staircases at all, really. We set up the body bag and loaded her in. Of course some of the fluids and whatnot got on the outside of the body bag. We loaded her onto the stretcher and carried her out of the house. She stank up the minivan all the way back to the city. It was winter and quite cold out, but we had to drive with all the windows down to try and survive the putrid odor.